we have a tradition to get the perspective of the international experts in an international panel. And it's almost the same strategic thinkers from all over the world that share with me a quick panel, very dynamic, on what's going on in the world with Israeli perspective. So I will call upon Ms. Michèle Flournoy, a former deputy of the Secretary of Defense, also a colleague, a head of a think tank in Washington, CNAS, and she's now in a transition also to the private sector. Michèle, please. François Heisbourg, a thinker from Europe, a Frenchman who was selected by the Brits, which is very, very unusual, to be the head of a leading think tank, not only in Europe, globally, International Institute for Strategic Studies. François, please. My colleague and friend, David Petraeus, a hero, an American hero, US Army, the commander of the surge in Iraq, who basically changed everything until it was changed again. Four-star general commanding CENTCOM, then due to the request of the president, went to Afghanistan to do what he proved so much in Iraq in his capabilities, and then was called to be the head of CIA. David, please. Last but not least, Thomas Friedman, a journalist, a columnist, a writer of wonderful books, very highly recommended, 3 times, I think, Pulitzer Prize. From 1995, he's writing the foreign policy column in the New York Times, and always, always have new ideas. So Tom, please. I want to go directly to the issues. Don't let them give you all what they think about the war. And I will start with Michèle. Take us away from the Middle East to the most dangerous political and military crisis today, which is North Korea. Senator Lindsey Graham said that there is 30% chances of a military operation in North Korea to stop the fact that North Korea is now capable to launch missiles, not only to Guam, not only to Hawaii, but to the United States itself, continental United States, with nuclear weapons. So what is your take about the chance of war? And if war is not recommended, what is your recommendation?
Thank you, Amos, and congratulations on putting together what is bound to be another wonderful conference. You know, I think the risk of war is at least that high, because not that either side would intend necessarily to go to war deliberately, but because the risk of miscalculation is higher than I've seen it in many, many years. The rhetoric, the heated rhetoric on both sides, the provocative actions that North Korea has been taken. Fortunately, we've seen a little bit of a pause as the Olympics approach reduction in tension, but I think that's at least a temporary thing. We're not sure what will happen once the Olympic Games are over. People always ask, you know, is there a viable military option for dealing with the North Korean and ICBM threat? And what I would say is there are always military options. The question is, are the benefits greater than the costs and the risks? If you look, just a few facts, if you look at the nuclear arsenal of North Korea, this is not, you know, like a nascent program like Iran had. This is a developed nuclear arsenal of dozens of weapons that are dispersed across many facilities, many of them deeply buried. Same on the missile program. Many of them mobile, difficult to find. And in addition, so it's very difficult to imagine an effective and surgical operation. In addition, you have tens of thousands of pieces of artillery that can range Seoul, a city of 25 million civilians. And so it's difficult to imagine any kinetic military strike against North Korea that wouldn't evoke or provoke a response against the South Korean population. And I think given the lack of communication, the lack of mutual understanding, there's a very high risk of such a situation escalating into a full conflict. And that conflict would be much more deadly and intense than any of the wars we've seen in the last 15 years. So my view is if that's the likely scenario, path that you go down with military use, we better be using military pressure to make our diplomacy more effective, to see if we can't stop deployment of the missile, stop testing of the nuclear arsenal, bolster deterrence, make it very clear in no uncertain terms that if he ever uses a nuclear weapon, that's the end of his regime. Build our defenses and use every tool in our toolbox, from covert means to sanctions, to diplomacy, to pressure, to incentives, to try to reduce the danger that this threat poses. But I think we're fooling ourselves if we think there's an easy or costless military option.
Thank you, Michèle. So the chances are not 30%. What is your number?
I'm sorry?
What is your number?
My number? Well, at the height of the insults being exchanged and the provocations on the part of Kim Jong-un, it was inching towards 50-50. I think with the recent calm, it's dropped somewhat. But again, I think that's a tactical move because of the Olympics, and we should use that opportunity to try to make our pressure work towards getting some kind of discussions and negotiations started after the Olympics are over.
Okay, François, another area of concern is Iran. The President of the United States wants to walk away from the deal. He certified it twice, but he declares that he will not do it again. He tried to send it to Congress. Congress haven't reacted. And now he is counting on the Europeans. He asked the Europeans to help him fix the deal. What is your assessment of the Europeans' capability to deliver a change, fixing of the deal, and what the Europeans can give the President that he will be satisfied and will not walk away from the deal?
Yeah, Amos, first of all, it's a joy to be back here. It's always wonderful to see so many friends, and working with the INSS has always been a pleasure. The INSS and the RAND Corporation conducted, as you well know, a simulation quite recently on the basis of President Trump's announcement of a bit more than 2 weeks ago. You wrote the abstract of that simulation, and the outcome of the simulation is negative in all scenarios, on the basis of current positions, that is. If that is the case, if the simulation proves to be correct, at around the 12th or the 13th of May, we would have the choice of either seeing President Trump tear up the JCPOA, and then we enter into completely uncharted territory. We would possibly have a war in which Saudi capabilities and incompetence would meet Iranian lesser capabilities but much higher degree of competence. And what the outcome of that would be, I don't know. And the other branch of the alternative would be to have President Trump essentially say, well, I never meant any of what I said. And that would pose a credibility problem of an order of magnitude not different from that of President Obama in August 2013. President Trump has drawn a red line here, or so it looks like it. So what can the Europeans do, since the President has kindly asked us to pick up the ball, which his Congress doesn't want to pick up? This is it's a very strange spectacle, by the way, to see this happen. The Europeans are not going to change the JCPOA because that would imply that you actually take it apart and build it back together again. It's not going to happen. What you can do is to think of side deals. Side deal one, sunset clause, side deal two on the inspections, not going to happen. Here you are inside the JCPOA. Where there is scope is on ballistic missiles. And the French, who, through no fault of their own, happen to have, I think, just about the only functioning Western government these days in, Germany, Italy, Britain, not to mention other countries. The French have made some quite clear indications ever since President Macron's speech in New York last September that ballistic missiles are an issue which would be worth discussing. So on that one, I think the Europeans will try hard. Would the Iranians be ready to move? I don't know, but the ballistic missile program of Iran for the time being is quite different in terms of ICBMs than that of North Korea. And there may just be scope for movement. So, advice to Trump under these circumstances. Well, it's still relatively early into the 120 days. President Trump can still refocus, reorient the expectations, make them about ballistic missiles rather than about other stuff, in which case, possibly, there could be a fortunate outcome on this one, on this particular episode. In the meantime, in terms of relations with the Saudis, I used the word incompetence earlier on, which may sound a bit harsh, but the French played a little role in delivering Prime Minister Hariri. It's still very difficult to explain in any rational words what the Saudis thought they were doing. But they clearly were thinking it, and that was not a sign of very high competence. And the episode of Saleh in Yemen, where they managed to turn around one of their adversaries, what happens? Guy gets killed within 48 hours. Does this demonstrate competence? Probably not. In other words, if you have an ally and a partner of limited competence as the Saudis, you don't write them blank checks. You make sure that you're present, that you're active. You make it clear that you're supportive of them, but you keep them on a short leash. Advice to Prime Minister Netanyahu. If President Trump were to go down the road I indicated on the JCPOA, that is focusing on ballistic missiles, then I think it would be quite important for the Israelis not to make President Trump's life too difficult in Congress. We know that there is an ability to mobilize Congress. I don't think that this should be done in vain. Those would be my 3 bits, if I can put it that way.
Thank you, François. Let's move to Syria. There are still 2,000 American soldiers in Syria. Their objective was to defeat ISIS. They have done it with the Kurds and the SDF. And now, I think the US is in a position that they have to decide whether they stay with their allies, the Kurds, or they are letting the Turks, which are now invading Syria, going after the Kurds. It's a dilemma. How would you deal with this dilemma in Syria? And anything else on the American policy in Syria especially comparing the two administrations, because the words of President Trump were much more anti-Iranian, anti-Syrian than the Obama administration, but there is a huge gap between the words and the deeds. How you see it, General Petraeus?
Well, thanks, Amos, and congrats as well to you and INSS for another great gathering. It is a privilege to be on the stage with Michèle, François, and Tom, and you. Look, since the last year at INSS, when we talked about Syria, there have, as you noted, been a number of reasonably heartening developments while noting continued violence, continued challenges, and so forth. But I have certainly been pleased to see in Syria, finally, what we advised several of us on stage 3 years ago, which was the establishment of safe zones, trying to tamp down the bloodshed, and using no-fly zones if necessary as well. We haven't said that that's what we've done, but in effect, what we have done in northeastern Syria, also in another enclave and a few other places, we have essentially done that. This has also, of course, been critical as we have enabled the Syrian Kurds and also some Syrian Sunni Arabs and the Syrian Defense Forces to defeat the Islamic State in the bulk of the territory that they had. There's still some remnants down around Abu Kamal in the southeast portion of the Euphrates before it enters Iraq, and they're working on those now. Keeping in mind, by the way, this is defeating the Islamic State as an army. There will still be Islamic State as insurgents and terrorists, not just in Syria, but also, as we have seen, in Iraq as well. And frankly, I'm pleased to see the bloodshed and refugee flows diminished, at least, still does continue. And as I mentioned, fighting certainly is raging in places like Idlib, Afrin, and elsewhere, but again, reduced considerably. At the end of the day, I hope the U.S. will stay. I hope we'll help safeguard the Kurdish and Sunni Arab members of the SDF that we have helped to defeat the Islamic State. We've done this with a modest number of U.S. forces and a lot of enablers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, precision strike capabilities, and industrial strength fusion of intelligence. I hope we can also, to address your issue, not only keep the pressure on Daesh in its remaining locations, but pursue initiatives to reassure Turkey over their legitimate concerns about the YPG, the Syrian Kurds, who they see as cousins of the PKK, the Turkish Kurd extremists. This will not be easy. There may have to be some compromises in some of the areas and some other pledges. And again, we may have to stay to safeguard and to ensure that their Syrian Kurd allies don't get carried away with what they might do, but also, frankly, again, to stand by them should there be threats from our Turkish allies. I hope we'll stay so ISIS doesn't come back, but also, frankly, and I thought it was very revealing when the Secretary of State opened up about all the objectives that we have, which also have to do to make sure that we thwart Iran's efforts to establish a ground line of communication that would run from in the capital of Iran, Tehran, through Baghdad, through Syria, and then down the Bekaa into southern Lebanon. And we are doing that with our presence right now, knowing that terrain very, very well from 4 years in Iraq. I hope, frankly, we can thwart Iran's efforts to Lebanonize Syria and also Iraq, using the Shia militia. The Chief of Staff talked about tens of thousands of these introduced into Syria, tens of thousands more supported in Iraq. And we want to stay to be part of this solution. We also, ironically, want to work with one of our adversaries, Russia, and Israel, to try to prevent Iran from having bases in Syria as well. You know, ultimately, there may be a political arrangement that puts Humpty Dumpty back together again, although I am a bit skeptical of that. There's no guarantee of that outcome or actually what the eventual resolution may look like. One thing we do know is that if we disengage, we lose our influence, and we have seen what happens in this region when we have done just that. So I'm hopeful again that we'll remain on the ground in Syria and, of course, in Iraq as well, to help shape the evolving situations in those countries, and again, to prevent Iran from establishing the kind of hegemony it would like to achieve in the region.
Thank you, David. From Syria to Saudi Arabia, MBS. I think, Tom, you have more hours with MBS than anybody in this room.
Maybe Dave has more. I'm sure Dave has more.
Okay, so David will have a second opinion later on. And I always wonder whether he is the Saudi HaTarbut that takes Saudi from the 19th century to the 21st century to a moderate state, or he will never reach the age of 35. So what is your assessment?
Amos, it's a very good way to frame the question. And thank you again for having me here to the INS. And Frank, thank you. Let me start at 30,000 feet, because I think you can't understand the Iran situation, what's at stake there, unless you do. So I have a sort of personal connection, because I arrived in the Middle East as a cub reporter almost 40 years ago. I arrived in 1979 in Beirut, and the first two stories I covered were the Iranian Islamic Revolution and the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Okay. There are vintage years in wine, Amos, and there are vintage years in history. And 79 was a vintage year, because the Iranian takeover of the Islamic Revolution in Iran put Shia Islam on a real right turn. The takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca was no less important. We forget what happened. 500 insurgents carrying coffins showed up at the Kaaba, as people often carried coffins around there, and opened them up. They took out Kalashnikovs. They took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca for 2 weeks. It took French paratroopers to get them out. And during those 2 weeks, they broadcast 24 hours a day that the Saudi ruling family were womanizers, drinkers, perverters of Islam. And that freaked out the Saudi ruling family. And they took Sunni Islam on a right turn, just when Shia Islam was going on a right turn. But 1979 wasn't done, because the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And we then leveraged that Sunni right turn to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan. 1979 wasn't over, though, because 3 Mile Island nuclear plant melted down in 1979, and America basically never built another new nuclear reactor. We essentially went out of the nuclear business, making us more dependent on fossil fuels. And in 1979, Deng Xiaoping, actually late 78, said Chinese farmers could keep their profits, launching China on a capitalist track. So demand for fossil fuels went up, prices went up, and Sunni Islam and Shia Islam lost their brakes in the same year. And I believe that was a pivotal moment for the Middle East, for the world, a moment that ended in 9/11. They changed the face of Islam, and not in a good way. And if you want to see how they changed the face, look at the graduating class picture of Cairo University, 1960. You will see men and women, and none of the women are veiled. And look at the graduating class today, and you will see virtually all the women are veiled. So I think something very big is at stake if we have a leader in Saudi Arabia who is ready to turn Saudi Arabia back from the 1979 course. So the first thing I would say about MBS is that if he didn't exist, the system would have had to invent him, because that system was going down. If you look where their financial reserves were, where they were going, that system is going down. If the system didn't exist, they would have had to invent him. And the other thing I would say about him is he's much more McKinsey than Wahhabi, okay? That his whole mindset, much more McKinsey than Wahhabi. Now, at the personal level, and you alluded to this, he has some really good instincts, and he has some really bad instincts. And he has no coach. He has no coach around him, no adult supervision. We have no U.S. ambassador in Riyadh today.
Can David coach him?
I would love to see Dave be appointed U.S. ambassador to Riyadh. He's exactly the kind of coach we could use. He has no one around him who can really say, you know, abducting the Lebanese prime minister and getting him to resign from Riyadh, not a good idea, you know? Trying to oust the Qatari government, not a good idea. Jumping into the middle of Lebanon, not a good idea. But at the same time, that impulsiveness that prompts him to go in that direction, also, women are going to drive. Stop this nonsense. Women are going to drive. We're going to bring rock stars and concerts and rap singers to Saudi Arabia. Women are going to attend soccer games. And the other thing you need to know about this is he is as much responding from what is coming up from below as what he is driving. There is a new generation in Iran and in Saudi Arabia that are fed up with 1979. When I was getting ready for the interview, I was in my hotel, and a Saudi guy came up to me and said, "You're Tom Friedman?" I said, "Yeah." He said, would you have lunch with me and my boss? He's a banker, and his boss was in from Dubai. And in the course of the lunch, he said, "You know, Mr. Tom, my life was hijacked in 1979. I know with MBS, my daughter's life will not be hijacked." So there's a lot of popular support to what he is doing. But I look at Saudi Arabia today, because a lot of people say, "Oh, you're too optimistic." I'm not optimistic or not optimistic. It's very clear. You got three choices. You want to have a democracy and free election? I can tell you exactly who will be elected. Guys with beards who don't speak English. Trust me. And they won't attend the INSS conference, okay? You want to have the old way, the consensus in the family. That wasn't consensus. It was a series of fiefdoms. You get the foreign ministry, you get the defense ministry, you get the National Guard, and that's what gave you reform in Saudi Arabia at 5 miles an hour. You got a third option, a modernizing autocrat. That's what you got, you know what I mean? With a lot of good and really bad instincts. So I'm fastening my seatbelt. I'm hoping for the best, as I said in my column of the interview, to predict, only a fool would predict success. But only a fool would root against it, because the other options are terrible. And when you consider how much money we have spent countering Muslim extremism post-1979, the fact that we maybe sort of, if you hold it up to the right light, have a Saudi leader who, for the first time from within Saudi Arabia, which is the only place that course can be reversed, is ready to go down that track, is hugely important. Let me just say one last thing. I've been no fan, if you read my stuff on Saudi Arabia, okay, but I put them in the dock after 9/11. But I do know this. What was my criticism of them for all these years? It was, you bastards. We tell you to arrest somebody, oh, you arrest them. We tell you to stop that bank from sending money, you stop sending that bank. But here's one thing you never do. You never take the Islamists on ideologically. You never take them on in a war of ideas. And to me, the most interesting thing he said to me in the interview, and he said this to others as well, in Arabic, in Saudi Arabia, he said to me, "Do not say, Mr. Friedman, that I am reforming Islam. I am restoring Islam to its pluralistic nature, to a religion that embraced other faiths, that respected women." He was saying that in his own words. And that's a big deal. So, hey, I'm rooting for the reform to work. I'm not starry-eyed about this, but if somebody has a better option out there, I'll give you my card.
So we are going for M&M, modern and moderate Islam. Is
Yeah.
it possible, David?
Not impossible. Certainly all of us have seen modern and moderate Islam. His goal in that regard, I think, is not just important for Saudi Arabia, it's not just important for the region, it's important for the world. When you think of what Saudi support has done in countries like Bosnia or Brussels, Belgium, or Bangladesh, or a variety of other places where what they have promoted has turned out to be so ultra-conservative, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to extremism, I think that's a very, very big development. And I think it is actually possible. We've all spent many, many hours of our lives in this region with modern, moderate Muslims.
I agree, obviously, with both Tom and Dave in terms of their bottom lines. Tom, you said all of the other alternatives are worse, and that's true. And you are saying the stakes couldn't be higher. You're right. The problem, though, is that our chances of success, I think, are intrinsically moderate. And we have to prepare for the possibility that things are not going to work out the way we would hope they do. We are not helped by the fact that our knowledge of what happens in the bowels of the Saudi system is very limited indeed. Saudi Arabia is a family, it's not a state, and it is a very large family, and it's a very complex family. There are others in this room who know more about it than I do. But at the end of the day, we simply have to avow a very high degree of ignorance. So a forward planner in Israel or in France or in the United States has to assume that the likelihood of success is probably less than 50%. And if that is the case, you do have to do hedging, you do have to do contingency planning. Chances are that it's going to get worse rather than better.
Let me just offer what MBS said to me one time after he'd been laying this out. And he knew I was, I've actually described this as both fantastic, the Vision 2030 and so forth, and fantastical. And he finally turned to me and he said, General, if we only achieve 60%, 40% of what I've laid out, it would be a dramatic level of progress. And that is certainly my hope that it's going to be over 50%. But word to the wise, to be sure, you should have been in the intelligence business. You can never go wrong by predicting disaster.
Yeah, I would just pick up on what both, the thing I've said almost to people is that I think the biggest question about MBS is not whether he is too young, too reckless, too greedy, too power hungry. It's whether he's too late. I think that's the big question. And I say that also because time has not stood still. We're now entering an AI world where basically middle skilled work all over the world is being devoured. Okay, the days when you could have a big middle class based on middle skilled work. So we're either going to have high wage, high skilled work or low wage, low skilled work. Now Saudi Arabia did not educate people who could do average work when average work could pay an average wage. And we're heading into a world now where they want to sort of reform their domestic labor market, educate their people. They are so far behind. And at the same time, I would point to another dimension. I think the climate issues, you cannot understand what happened in Syria if you don't understand that there was a 4-year drought that moved 1 million people off the land in the 4 years preceding the uprising. You can't understand what just happened in Iran if you don't connect it to the drought issues there. And Mother Nature, she's not sitting back saying, gosh, I hope you guys, I'll give you guys some time. Mother Nature is just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. And she, you can't talk her up, you can't talk her down, and she always bats last, and she always bats 1,000. Do not with Mother Nature. And that is what these people have been doing. And that Mother Nature dimension of the story is stealing time on one side and computing is on the other.
Okay, we are running out of time.
Have a nice day.
We are running out of time. Let's go to tweeting. I ask you a question and you will answer it in 288 characters, maybe words, but short. President Trump heard about this important conference and about your panel, and he called you to the White House, and his patient is for a very short answer. What can I do better in 2018 that I haven't done in 2017? Michèle, what you will recommend? 5 minutes.
Listen to your most experienced advisors, and when they are giving you a consensus recommendation, follow it, even if it means ignoring or forgetting what you said on the campaign trail. 2, even though you're upset about the Russia investigations, do not be blind to the very real threats that Russia is posing to American democracy and democracies across Europe, and do something, do something about it. 3rd, do not walk away from America's historic and critical leadership role in sustaining a rules-based international order, because when we create a vacuum, and our allies cannot rely on us, very bad things happen. And last, stop tweeting on national security issues, please.
Thank you, Michèle. François, you already spoiled my question, but try again.
Okay, first recommendation, do not do what Obama did in 2011 and 2013. 2011, Libya was leading from behind. You don't get anywhere in the Middle East if you lead from behind. And you don't get anywhere in the Middle East by writing blank checks either, which I think was Trump's big mistake in his first visit to Saudi. And 2013 was the red line drawn in vain. Don't do that again. So listen to your European friends. And when Macron goes to Tehran in a few weeks' time, before he comes to Washington on a state visit in the second half of April, play with him and not against him. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
5 quick points. Don't declare mission accomplished anywhere, especially in the Middle East. Most foreign policy issues can't be solved. They can only be managed. They require America to stay engaged, including through a military presence. Second, recognize there are no purely military solutions, but also no purely diplomatic or political solutions either. Comprehensive approaches are required as always. An American foreign policy only succeeds when all elements of national power are woven together and complement each other, and integration can only be done from the White House. 3, focus on hitting singles and doubles in the Middle East for a while. There are no home runs to be had out in this region right now, and we don't want to strike out by overreaching. 4, as a general rule, treat your friends as friends and your enemies as enemies, and know the difference between the two. Israel and the other Western democracies are friends. So are the moderate Sunnis. Russia and Iran and even China are not. They are rivals, and we need to compete, deter, balance, and coexist with them. And finally, number 5, the ultimate measure of American greatness is our reconciliations, not our divisions as a country. And the greatest threat to American security right now may be the deepening polarization within our own family.
Though I agree with all of those. Those are all great. I would say just a couple things. One is remember that the Middle East only puts a smile on your face when it starts with them. Camp David started with them. Oslo started with them. The Arab Spring started with them. There's only one Arab Spring country that succeeded. It's the one we had nothing to do with. It's called Tunisia. And right now I'd be doing everything I could to quietly strengthen the Tunisian case, example, and model as a model for the whole rest of the region. They're under siege from Libya, got terrible economic problems. We're sending all this money to Egypt, a country whose president is arresting every other presidential candidate, and we're letting the one country in the Arab world that actually wrote a fantastic constitution on its own wither on the vine. The other thing I would say is to pick up on what Dave said, and that is to understand what really makes America great. And I got a little taste of that, Amos, because I took a trip to the Middle East in August with the head of the U.S. Air Force, Dave Goldfein. And I was actually in Doha, Qatar, the night of Charlottesville. Now, sometimes as a columnist, you're in the right place at the right time, and sometimes you're in the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time. And I was sitting in Doha thinking, what am I going to write when the whole world is talking about Charlottesville? And then I looked around at our little traveling party. And I realized that I was traveling with the head of the U.S. Air Force, and he's Jewish. We were traveling with the Air Force Secretary, and she's a woman. We were traveling with her executive officer. She was an African-American Air Force Lieutenant Colonel woman. Their guard's name was Juan. The head of the U.S. Air War in the Middle East is an Armenian-American. His deputy is a Lebanese-American, and the chief of intelligence who briefed us name was Yang. Mr. Trump, which part of that sentence Don't you understand?
Okay, I got a phone call from somebody who say, me too. And it's the Prime Minister just coming back from Russia. So he wants advice as well. And this will be the last round. Quick advice to Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Mr. Prime Minister, you have had the great privilege of leading the great state of Israel for many, many years. Great leaders are remembered in history not for how they came into office, but for how they leave office. You have an opportunity, if you're willing to take some personal political risk, to move this country forward towards a sustainable, just, and lasting peace. But you have to take those risks.
I'll be briefer. I'll say, Mr. President, your representative who was in Tel Aviv recently, the Honorable Jason D. Greenblatt, gave a very remarkable speech expressing the position of the US administration on the peace process. You should support him, and maybe you could even read his speech and indicate your approval. That is very much in the direction of what you are saying. And as for Iran, I'll repeat what I said earlier on. This is a very, very tense moment. Trump has worked himself into a very delicate position, a position which is dangerous, potentially dangerous for him in terms of outcome. Don't make his life more difficult by speaking about the JCPOA the way you did in the framework of past electoral campaigns.
David?
Well, look, I wouldn't presume to instruct an Israeli leader on anything. I think I'd take the opportunity to ask some questions and listen, ask him perhaps what he's trying to accomplish in his remaining time in office, what's possible in the region, what do you see as the greatest opportunities, greatest risks? What's your deepest ambition in your remaining time in office? You know, I think sometimes the wisest approach for Americans in this region in particular is to talk a bit less and listen a bit more. Personally, I find I learned a lot more in such cases. Thanks.
Mine would be brief. Tell me how Israel will remain a Jewish democratic state with 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. And if you don't have a good answer for that, put a peace map on the table.
Okay. Thank you very much for your wonderful insights and understanding of the global issue and the local issue. We're concluding, I think, a very interesting evening with a lot to learn. This is only a taste for another 2 long, long days, tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Good night, everybody. Drive safely home, and see you tomorrow.